Welcome to The Third Space, a show where we strive to reclaim the vital realm between home and workplace, igniting transformative conversations in the pursuit of wisdom. I'm your host, Avi, and my guest today is Zach Gomer. Zach is studying for his PhD in education. He served as chaplain in the Victoria Police, been a teacher at multiple schools across Melbourne, including assistant principal at Biala College, and he's also served as a sergeant in the Israeli Defense Force. I hope you enjoy today's conversation. I want to talk about the role of classical religion in modern society. And I want to read to you a quote from the author David Foster Wallace, which I think is a really good launching pad for the question. He says, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it Jesus Christ or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess, or the Four Noble Truths, or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive." It seems quite clear to me that when you look at the world today, undoubtedly becoming far more secular. Although I did read Dominion recently by Tom Holland, and he talks about the dichotomy of religious versus secular being a Western concept that was inherited by Christianity, from Christianity. And that other cultures don't necessarily think about the world in those terms. But anyways, I think, from the Enlightenment, we're becoming more secular, and I don't think that necessarily means that by dropping classical religions that we're dropping religion entirely. I think humans still have a religious inclination, and that a lot of modern political and social movements or ideologies still have some kind of religious structure to them. Like, for example, environmentalism. Environmentalism has a concept of the sacred, nature. They've got rituals. Every day you recycle, you plant trees. They've got an ethical framework, all of the responsibilities and stewardship over the earth. You could even argue they have a sense of the transcendent, which is through the action that we take, the sustainable action, we can actually safeguard the future for our children and our grandchildren. So it seems to me that we still have a yearning for religion, specifically the aesthetics and the ritual, but maybe not the mythology or the belief in a supernatural. Do you agree with this assessment?
I fundamentally do. And I think that, one of the most poignant examples is that we have, in recent human history, a number of societies who made the decision to be consciously and violently non-religious. The communist societies. That was a key, element of most communist states that came into existence. That literally, generally, there was violence against the existence of religion, or at least the influence of religion in any significant way. And I think almost every single one of those societies ended up developing a religion, a religious worship of leadership, individual leaders that became quasi-divine, and Marxism, Leninism, communism, depending on the context, Maoism being gospel. And so, you end up having the same rituals, the same imagery, the same. And so I do believe that we are inherently spiritual beings, and that the idea that we would act otherwise had its time a little bit, I think, again, and maybe in the last few decades, there was this impression that we would, just as we would move to this liberal world order, we would move to a kind of more secular world order. and that would only be good, that everything negative in human history was a result of superstitions and silliness and religion, which was the opium of the masses, and that if we could all just be rational beings, then everything would be great. I think that hasn't played out. I'm not getting any joy out of that, but I don't think that has played out. And I do think that rather than becoming all these uber-rational societies and people, we have societies that feel overwhelmed by an inherent sense of emptiness. And I think people, without mentioning religion, are constantly, from what I can observe, discussing this deep sense of angst and this deep sense of purposelessness that pervades society. And I do think people find ways that are inherently religious in everything but terminology to find meaning, whether that's the environmental meaning or various social causes that people adhere to and promote in a religious fashion. I think I can't see it any way other than that. And listen, I do identify myself as a religious person. I do believe that to be true, and I do believe that to be a positive component of my identity that I strive to be worthy of. I don't shy away from that by any means. But I can certainly recognize that religions throughout history, throughout societies, have played destructive roles. Of course they have. And so whilst I do have a genuine faith, I recognize that any belief system is as good as it is applied by the people who practice it. And that almost every belief system, there are certainly exceptions, can lead to great good and to great evil. Even truths can be the impetus for great evil, and maybe I'll give perhaps like a controversial example of that. The concerns about the environment, I think, are very valid, and I think that being interested in preserving a positive natural environment and a positive climate are obviously fundamentally and inherently admirable. That can certainly be applied in ways that I think are immoral. So, for example, the developed world has gone through a process of development that was very energy intensive and has led, with all of the problems that exist in developed societies, to an incredible reduction of abject poverty. There are certainly plenty of people living in poverty, and in some ways it's getting worse. But we don't have, we have issues of malnutrition. We don't have, for example, starvation throughout much of the developed world. And it's perhaps hard for us, again, without looking at history, to realize that frequent whole-scale starvation was the norm for all of human history until very recently. Mm-hmm. That's a big change. Like that's maybe the most significant individual change in what it means to be alive as a human that's ever happened. That in a couple generations we went from most people being at the risk of literally starving to death all of the time to that being rare. Mm-hmm. That's incredible, right? If we say that having an immediate, absolute change in the environmental trajectory is the number one necessity at all costs, that necessitates accepting that many people in the developing world will not have that same opportunity. And again, you might turn around and say, well, it's better that they don't develop and be alive than don't develop and be dead. Sure, okay, there's logic to that. But A, have you asked them? Have they participated in this conversation?
Yeah.
And B, will you swap places? Because if it is better, no problem. Leave your home in Melbourne, move to one of the most underdeveloped countries in sub-Saharan Africa and swap places. And none of them are willing to do that, of course. And I'm not expecting them to do that. But what I'm saying is that, you can't then say you have an untainted, unquestionable morality that has absolutely no nuance to it whatsoever, as a product of your concern about the environment. Mm-hmm. Everything has consequences, and those consequences need to be considered. And the only logic I can give for somebody saying, I won't even consider that line of thinking, is that they are adhering to a religious dogma. Mm-hmm. And that dogma doesn't allow for nuance. Mm-hmm. That dogma doesn't allow for any broader consideration. And again, I'm not saying that I have solutions to the environmental problem that I'm suggesting, but I'm just saying that, you know, there is no moral absolutism. Everything has to be considered. That's what I love about the Jewish tradition, by the way, specifically, is a consistent understanding of nuance, of a multiplicity of perspectives, and of a fundamental premise on the worth of the human being. You know, that we in Judaism, it's throughout the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, constant refrains that the God who requests sacrifices rejects sacrifices when they are given by people who ignore the cries of the poor and unfortunate. And God consistently throughout the prophets repeats a mantra saying, like, I told you to be sacrificed, but second, you know, you can't say I'm taking this and I'm going to give it to God if that means that this produce won't go to feed people who are starving. No, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work that way. That dogma doesn't fly. And I think that anyone, whatever their worldview is, I would suggest would be well served by having a similar perspective, saying, you know, is the environment important? Absolutely. Like, you know, that is also a factor of life and death. But every action has a reaction, and everything has a secondary impact. At least be open to that conversation. At least think that through. Yeah.
You would say that classical religion does still have a very important place in modern society, in the same way that any modern movement does, in the sense that it can be used, it's a tool or a technology you can consider that can be used for good or bad, depending on the practitioner themselves. If you think about each religion as kind of like a code base. Yeah. I'm a programmer, so these are the terms I tend to think in. If you think about it in terms of a code base, there are some aspects or components of that code base which do still fit the modern UI or the modern hardware that they're instantiated within. Yeah. But there are some parts of that code base that might be like legacy code that need to be replaced. Do you, on the spectrum of rejectionists to reconciliationists, where exactly do you sit? And what I mean by that is rejectionists being like very closed off to change, keeping things exactly the way they are. Reconciliationists sort of pandering to modernity and changing things to be more relevant.
So I'm hesitant to kind of comment about, you know, my analysis or suggestions to other religious traditions, because, you know, I'm not a member of another religious tradition, and I wouldn't feel that I was doing justice by doing so.
Sorry, I should have been clear. I was talking about Judaism.
Absolutely, no. I imagine so, but I do think, you know, I can respect other traditions without equivocation, and I think that, you know, there isn't a religious tradition that exists, certainly not a mainstream ongoing one, that hasn't had positive influences and doesn't have elements of its contemporary observance that I think are incredibly admirable. And I think that, you know, religion in general, without specifics, for many people, for an enormous number of people today and throughout the past, and I believe into the future, is a extremely significant source of meaning, of identity, of purpose, of community, of comfort, of literal assistance through charity and communal support. And again, I think that, you know, we've had a tendency to view negatives which are very real and, you know, deserved to be addressed absolutely, and may well have been in contrast to the very essence of the tradition or religious faith that facilitated their outcome. But we've lost something so huge by doing so. There's something enormous that's been lost. And a key example that I'll give, I've heard people complain very often about not having a third space. The people have their homes where they live, they have where they work, and there's nowhere in between. And there's almost nowhere left today that one can go without having to spend money. Public libraries, people often say it was like the only example. Everywhere else you have to go and spend money, and that's to me that's horribly dystopian. What a horrible context in which to live. It's not a context I can share because I don't live like that. We have 50,000 odd Jews in Melbourne. It's not an enormous number of people relative to the population. We have so many synagogues and communal institutions that I find myself constantly attending in various places, never taking my wallet out of my pocket. And I just don't feel that way at all. I feel like I constantly have third places. I have third, fourth, fifth, sixth, many places. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that, there is a model there for something that's lost. At the same time, I do think that one of Judaism's strengths and one of the reasons why Judaism has existed across so many contexts for so long that it's almost unbelievable that it's done so, is Judaism's incredibly sophisticated ability to dance between adaptation and continuity. And that particularly, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and again, I'm not going to speak for people who share other perspectives. That wouldn't be right. But I think that Orthodox Judaism in particular is able to do that, and that there are elements of how I live my life that are of course distinct from other observant Jews throughout history. But I also know that I could walk into a synagogue today in Tel Aviv, in London, in California, in Mexico City, in Japan, an Orthodox synagogue, and I can participate absolutely without equivocation in our Jewish traditions, in our worship, in our service, in our prayer, in our life. We have a common language, which is Hebrew for prayer, even as most Jews throughout the diaspora were not speaking Hebrew, that was maintained. But I can also do so in 3rd century Yemen. And I could have gone to medieval Islamic Spain and gone to a synagogue. And I could have, every single one of these, and the same would apply. That is unbelievable. To me, that is, and whilst, of course, at every single one of those stages, there would have been people who would have said, let's just change it. Let's just make the prayer book in English. Let's just do whatever. The genius was the ability to resist that urge and to maintain it, whilst allowing things that could adapt and that should adapt to adapt. And again, every community at every stage, every person is going to be more inclined towards one direction rather than the other. And there certainly has been variety. And today there certainly is. There are Jewish communities throughout the world that fall upon a whole spectrum of more and less modern, more and less conservative. But still, even within that, I would say within, the Orthodox world, that still applies, even across that spectrum, even across the spectrum that we have like that here in Melbourne, which is very, very broad, very, very broad. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. And I think that I once had a work colleague who was a bit younger than me and probably saw the world differently to me, inherently, irrespective of that. When we were speaking about, I can't even remember what the matter was, and they said, but why don't we just change things? Because you can just change things, they can become better. And it's like, sure, you're right. And certainly we should be changing things all the time because things change. But the premise that change is always for the good is madness. It's absolute madness. That's not the case at all. At all. There are changes for the good. Equally, there are changes that are enormously for the worse. And again, I look at a society like Australia and like all societies, Australia has an infinite number of issues that should be addressed. And we have great, anyone with a heart and a brain would be concerned about so many things, even if their concern is only self-interest. Because I said to you that one of the key elements of a society's strength is social cohesion. That even if you are a complete sociopath who has absolutely no regard for others, which I do not recommend or think is what one should aspire to, our society only works because a majority of the society accepts the rules of the game, right? And people will only accept that when they feel that maintaining the system is more to their benefit than seeing it crumble, right? And so I think we should care about each other because we should care about each other. But if someone can't, for whatever reason, bring themselves to that point, then care about others just because you can't exist without them. You're not in isolation. We never are. So, again, what one might say is, well, there are all these problems, and these problems are very real, and they are completely unacceptable, which may very well be the case. Therefore, dismantle the entire system. And I would say that's unwise. Because with all of the flaws that our society has, and all the things that might, in the short term, be getting worse rather than getting better, I can't think of many contexts within which a human being has ever lived that are, on a scale the size of a country like Australia, that are as fair, as presenting of opportunities for as many people, have the opportunities for expression, representation, and living standard that Australia represents. So I'm not sure that there's an alternative that's immediately obvious as better. That doesn't mean that I don't think that we have, inequalities within our society which are unacceptable. I do. I inherently do. But my analysis today would be the system that exists is far more capable of attempting to address those inequalities and attempting to address those things than any other system I can think of. Yeah. And so what I would say is, yes, go for the change, but as long as someone wants to present an alternative, sure, I'm very keen to hear it. But until I'm convinced of that, which seems to be unlikely, then surely this system is use it. Do not pull it down, because I assure you, if you pull it down, the historical paradigm that's most likely is not an utopia replacing it, but nefarious individuals free of the constraints that our system provides, exploiting people in a way that is infinitely worse. Infinitely worse. Again, that by no means suggests that there aren't things that concern me, and there aren't things that I think need to be addressed with urgency and with absolute sincerity, commitment, and sacrifice. I do. But
that was beautifully said.
So that's
really beautifully said. Yeah, I like that perspective of having a sense of history informing the fact that things as the way they are is actually quite good, and change isn't necessarily what we want to strive for.
Yeah. Even if that means that there are individuals or groups of people for whom it is nowhere near as good as it is for others, which is an inherent problem that exists in all societies, but any ethical, moral person should want to address.
Yeah.
At the very least, everybody should have a as equal a possible opportunity to benefit from what our society has to offer. That there should not be structural impediments to people by virtue of whatever circumstance they're presented with through no fault of their own, preventing that. That's a constant flaw in humanity that I think addressing actually, to my mind, is the essence of what Judaism is. To me, the essence of Judaism is the recognition of that tendency and the commitment to addressing it.
I want to talk about the Melbourne Jewish community.
Sure.
Specifically, segueing from the previous topic we were talking about, which was about how classical religion, does actually still have a place within modern society. I mean, I do see issues with classical religion, obviously, at a communal level.
Sure.
And one of the issues I see, I've had conversations with lots of people in the Melbourne Jewish community about this, and I think it probably also applies to other minority communities embedded within a broader society, which is that of cliquiness.
Sure.
In Australia, in Melbourne, in the Jewish community, there are bubbles within bubbles.
Absolutely.
There are different schools, different shuls, people living in different suburbs, and people don't interact with each other at all. With all of that said, to play devil's advocate, I heard a really interesting perspective recently, which was if you look at Judaism and the sects within Judaism from an evolutionary lens, you can kind of think of each one as having its own survival strategy.
Yeah.
Think about Haredim, like ultra-Orthodox Jews. They completely reject modern technology. And if you think about it, it might not necessarily be the craziest thing in terms of maybe they're going to be the ones laughing in 20, 30 years' time when all of the concerns we have now about the harm of social media.
Sure.
I have a friend who's doing a PhD on screen addiction.
Yeah.
All of these negative things come to fruition.
Yeah.
They could actually be the ones laughing.
Yeah.
So all of these different sects that don't interact with each other very strongly, they don't really cross-pollinate. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's an adaptive thing on like a Judaism as a religion level.
Yeah.
So I wonder, in terms of that lens, do you think it's necessarily a bad thing that we're not as interconnected within the community as we could be? Or do you think it's harmful that there are people that fall through the cracks and there are people that get disillusioned by the narrow worldview that they're exposed to? Do you have any perspective on that?
So a few things. One, I think I just want to clarify what you mean. I think we're on the same page, but I just want to make sure. In terms of technology in the Haredi world, I think I don't think there's a whole-scale rejection. I think there's a very selective use.
Sure. Like the kosher phone, for instance.
Exactly, I think, there aren't many Haredi communities that don't have access to the technologies that we have. They might limit it and they might adapt it and have apps on, to restrict use of phone, or maybe they won't have a mobile phone, but a smartphone, they'll have a dumb phone, an analog phone, whatever it might be. So, and there's a whole spectrum within that, right? There's a whole, so that's very interesting in of itself. And I think, it's quite funny that, I think not that long ago, you'd hear somebody say 10, 20 years ago, I don't have a television in my home, I don't think they're mad. And now you have some of the leading people in the tech world who'd say they would never give their children a smartphone or access to social media. So, who knows, right? It's everything has both sides. But I think that in terms of the Melbourne Jewish community, of course there are cliques, of course there are bubbles and bubbles within bubbles. Emphatically the case. I do think, however, again, that relative to many communities, I don't know them all, so I can't say absolutely. I do think there is some fluidity between that, and I do think that you'll find that whether it's economic, geographic, level of observance, whatever it might be, friendship groups, there is still fluidity between the Jewish world to varying degrees and within the community. And I think that when that fluidity occurs is sometimes when we are at our most beautiful as a community. I feel that very strongly. And I'm somebody who throughout my life, without necessarily getting into the nuances of all the names of schools and whatever, I've kind of always found myself flowing between worlds, in a sense, in a way that probably is relatively rare, the extent and to which I do that. And I think that part of that is circumstance, but I think certainly part of that also is a sense in my personal sense of mind that at the end of the day we are one community, and that I personally don't feel that any one bubble is sufficient for me, and I'd say it's probably not. This it's difficult to make a call like this for somebody else. Probably not at the end of the day sufficient for any one individual member of any one individual bubble either. And if they really knew what they could gain from others, they would probably be desirous of that too. I believe that maybe that's naive.
Yeah.
But I think I don't want to make myself sound admirable in a way that I don't deserve. But I do find myself consistently drawn to the underdog, let's say. And I think that there are certainly people who fall through the cracks, and in a community that is rich and has an incredible array of institutions that are wonderful, schools, communal bodies, synagogues, exceptional, and they do exceptional things. Often they cater for who's already being served, which is logical and fair enough. And often as a community, we cater for the top. We look at what we often perceive as the best in terms of aesthetics, resources, whatnot, and that's kind of the gold standard. And I get that people like nice things and that's never fun. Like, we're all human. That I'm not here to criticize people, but when you do that, you by necessity forget those for whom that's just completely unrealistic and completely unattainable. And the reality is that whilst there are members of the Melbourne Jewish community that are, of course, very comfortable and in a high socioeconomic bracket, there is the entire range of the broader community within the Melbourne Jewish community, from a financial perspective, from a support perspective, from a well-being perspective. And there are so many people who can't or won't access the things those institutions have to offer, that people who are enmeshed in those bubbles just aren't even aware of, have no awareness of whatsoever. And to me, that's an absolute tragedy. That's not, to me, what ideally a community should be about. A community is about all of its members, whoever and wherever they are. And, we can't say we are a community that has solidarity and we care about each other, except for the 20% that we never see, except for the whatever it might be. That doesn't hold water. And so I really do believe it's a grave concern. And I believe that in a broader context, to touch what we spoke earlier of people's lives in some ways becoming harder across the whole country and whole society, that same phenomenon, of course, is occurring within the Jewish community, where there've always been people within the Jewish community that have not been in a position to engage as much as others for whatever reason. And I think that the virtue and value of a community, again, tying into the inherent fundamental values of Judaism, that same God who throughout the Jewish Bible says, don't bring me a sacrifice until you've heard the cry of those you're ignoring. Beautiful buildings, incredible institutions, great successes in all kinds of fields. None of that's a bad thing. But has the cry been heard? I'm not sure it always has. I'd say probably quite confidently it hasn't. And again, buildings crumble and go. Even in Melbourne, a Jewish community that's not that old, some of our most beautiful communal structures are almost abandoned because the community's moved or whatever has happened. So what? What do they do for us? What? So every now and then you might be aware of their existence and think that's nice, until they're sold off and become apartments, right? Like it's. I don't know that that's the measure of our success. We have an incredible community event, a kiddush, a function, with the most beautiful catered food. Sure, that's great. That's what is the eternal benefit of that? What is the real meaning with that? Whereas if we focus ourselves primarily on saying, do we have institutions that any Jew who is desirous of being involved in it can, for whatever reason, again, that issue of equality of opportunity that I spoke about earlier, that everybody has the access to which they desire, and people who don't even know where to start, has a hand been reached out to them? To me, that's the most important starting point. I know I'm sounding very moralistic, and it's very easy to say that.
Yeah.
And plenty of people are doing incredible work in so many places, and I don't want to diminish that. But if I was sitting here, as I guess I am, and being asked, what matters right now? Where is the direst need? To me, that's really, really clear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me also that there's a bit of a leakage that's going on in the sense of a lot of people, even my age, younger, who just never throughout their schooling received any appreciation or sense of wonder or an experience of God or anything like that. That's definitely something I experienced when I went to a Jewish school, Yeshiva College, and for me it was learning the Torah, learning halacha, Jewish law, other Jewish studies, and it just felt like a rote learning exercise. It was kind of empty, for me at least. Some other people may have got it, and naturally it kind of caused me, when I was a teenager, to leave the fold. I became an atheist, and only recently am I coming to an appreciation of things, and I wonder if that can be changed at all. If it's even possible to change that, or is it something that is a process of life experience, emotional maturity, in terms of getting that appreciation of Judaism or whatever religion, and also a conception of God and an experience of God. Is that I guess what I'm trying to ask is that something that we can distill and provide to children? I don't know. So
first of all, I reject the premise that you've left the fold. I think the fold is wherever you are.
Mm-hmm.
You are the.
So I meant more intellectually or philosophically. But physically, I'm definitely still.
Sure. But I would say that I reject even that premise. Okay. Not to reject your self identity, but I would say that
double rejection.
What are we as Jews? We are us.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fold of where and what Judaism is where and what the Jews are.
Mm-hmm.
And you and every other Jew is what constitutes that entity. Mm-hmm. And so if you felt, for whatever reason, and that you've desired or been forced or by circumstance or necessity, whatever it might be, to be in a place where you felt on the other side of a fold, I would say that's an error of perception rather than a reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that, first of all, yes, others should always be desirous of bringing you within their fold as well, but also you are not separable from this thing. You are this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you are this thing with absolute equivalence to any other individual member. There is no Jewish world without you. It can't be. You define it. So that's something I think is. It's not to reject your perception, but just to bring my own perception there. And I think that's
I'm coming to that. It's a frame that you only achieve once you kind of level up, so to speak.
Yeah, but even if there was time in your life when you didn't see it like that, that doesn't mean it wasn't that.
Mm.
And even if others don't see it like that, that's their error. That's not an objective observation, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that that makes me very sad that you said you didn't get that experience of wonder, and I think that every child in the world deserves that. Learning should be an experience, should be fundamentally, inherently an experience of wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And whilst, like anything worthwhile in life, it's going to have challenges as part of it, and an education that isn't challenging is not an education, it should still be fundamentally filled with wonder, with meaning, with purpose, with joy. It must be. It must be. I believe that very unequivocally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in all kinds of ways, we fail children, and always have. and fail in ways that we didn't fail them in the past, and compensate for ways that they were failed in the past. It's a constant, And listen, I've had my career as an educator and as a teacher, and ongoing, and I love that profession, and I love what it means when it works and when I feel like it's done right. And like every other person, teacher, or every human, I'm flawed and I don't always do it right. But when you do, you know, and you see. And I can't, I have 5 children of my own, and I have my wife and my family, and, that is my primary source of meaning and identity and purpose. But other than that, the feeling of having a child or a young adult express to you that you have been a positive influence in their lives, which I'm saying every child I've ever taught has shared that with me, but I have had that shared with me, as I believe, I hope most teachers have. There is nothing like that. There is nothing like that, and it is humbling. And I at least consistently feel, my immediate trend was always, oh my God, I didn't do nearly enough, but a sense that a child is so fundamentally vulnerable in so many ways, and there are no shortage of avenues to harm a child. And when you harm a child, you harm an adult, and you harm another generation, and you harm, there's no shortage of that. By contrast, the ability to do good for a child is infinite in its impact. And it's not an easy thing to do by any means. It is a very difficult thing to do. And it is, it's not always obvious how to do that. But I think that there are 2 fundamental attributes all good teachers have. One is, I'd say 3 actually in process. One is an absolute commitment to the children you're teaching. Sure, teaching's a job, of course, but it's not just a job. It's by no means just a job. The job is secondary. It is the life of human beings that you have in your hand. And you need to understand that and be aware of that and care about that. That's 1. 2 is, because you can still care about that but do bad things, right? Second is a willingness to learn yourself and to grow. Because like I said, just because you care doesn't mean you'll act in best practice. You have humility, and you need to know that, again, like I said, with someone leading a country, same thing, a teacher, same thing applies. No one has all the answers, and so you need to seek answers from everyone. You need to seek from the children you're teaching. You need to ask them constantly, all the time, am I giving you what you need? And to have a relationship with them that will allow them to speak to you honestly and genuinely. That doesn't mean you need to accept everything they say verbatim and on face value, sure. But you have to have a willingness to listen and have a willingness to dialogue. That's the second. And the third is a passion about what you're teaching. And kids immediately know when their teacher isn't passionate, and immediately know when they do. Yeah. And I think that, if I can distill down to those 3 things, even as I was saying it, I was kind of questioning myself. But I think if you distill to those 3, for the most part, you'll be okay. Yeah. And for the most part, the children in your care will be okay. But geez, it's like, where are the stakes higher? Right? Yeah. Where are they higher? Yeah. And I would say that, if you think about yourself and you think back into your own past, I would say almost certainly for every human being, childhood experiences are the dominant prisms through which you see the world throughout your whole life. You always come back to them in a way that you don't come back to experiences in your 20s and 30s. They can still live, but it's not the same. It's not the same. And I think that part of that is that inherent vulnerability. that of course a child, and a great part of education is building an agent, building a human being that has the ability and the power and the desire to be a positive influence on their own life and the life of others. But that has to be built. And children are, as I said, inherently vulnerable, and the world moves them and impacts them and shakes them in ways that the younger they are, the less control they have. And so that world has to be positive. That has to be positive. And the people in it have to, like, you can't ignore the significance of that. And so again, I don't know necessarily any of your individual teachers, and I can't, it's hard for you to comment on specifics, but I think that throughout the Jewish world and non-Jewish world, it doesn't matter, everywhere, as societies, as humanity, that has to be one of our primary concerns. Always is that next generation. And again, I know this is difficult what I'm going to raise now, and it raises difficulties for so many people, and I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I want to make that fundamentally clear. And that I recognize that there are no shortage of reasons why individuals don't have children, shouldn't have children, can't have children. Of course there are. And each case is individual and deserves absolute sympathy and no presumptions, because you don't know anyone's circumstance. But if, as a society as a whole, the raising of a subsequent generation is not our primary concern, we are untethered. We are untethered. And for many people, that will be their individual children. For some people, for whatever reason, it won't be, right? That's still significant, of course. Every society that improves because of that concern for the future. And that, it's that old adage of, the individual that plants the trees whose fruit they will never eat. And that's what we do all the time, everything that we do. And again, I'm afraid that while so much of that impetus has been diminished, not everywhere, but amongst many, of course people can still care about people in the future. And of course there are extraordinary people who can care as much as anyone ever has. But surely there is an extent to which that dynamic changes. Could there not? How could there not be? How could there not be? And one just very concrete example, again, there are plenty of people that have children who don't care about the future, people who don't, that do. Sure, I'm not talking about everyone, right? Would one not imagine that when one is putting a ballot in the ballot box and there is someone saying, we cannot increase our debt, a national debt, because it is unfair to pass on debt that will be applied to unborn people for individuals today without the deepest consideration and need, and somebody saying, you'll never have to pay it off. Don't you want XYZ? All those XYZ might always be valid. Of course, they always are, right? There's always... But that's a different dynamic. And again, I'm not here to judge or hurt anyone. And this is such a nuanced topic that involves deep levels of pain and concern for many. And that's not the point that I'm trying to make here. I'm not judging or criticizing anyone. Not at all. And I hope it doesn't come across as that. What I'm saying is that human societies, for the most part, have been societies that have had very concrete, collective, commitments to the future because of very tangible realities. Children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, the community's children, the neighborhood's children, whatever it might be, right? But when we have, I don't, remember the sticks off by heart, but I think it might even be the case that the average household in Australia today does not include children. That's not unique to Australia. That is a different society. And I can't imagine it's a society that will act in the same way. And that it's a society that will have as much of a commitment to the future as would otherwise be the case. And everything positive that we have right now, for the most part, is a consequence of the commitment to the future that people in the past who had less than us made.
Yeah.
That's it's people who did face those constant threats of starvation that, Australia's a more recent country, but even so, Australia's not. The contemporary infrastructure, let's say, that we have in Australia is generally newer than in some other parts of the world. If people hadn't done that, then those things just wouldn't be there. And not just talking about physical infrastructure, but I'm talking, of course, about every level of what it means to be human in our societies, from every culture and society that exists on Earth. And again, he spoke about that precipitous collapse societies might face. That happens for different reasons across different times. But again, I would imagine that a society that sees itself as less or less consistently connected tangibly to the future is going to be less well placed to weather those storms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to be proven otherwise. It's hard for me to imagine that's not, for the most part, a reality. Yeah.
Mm.
And as the father of 5 children, that concerns me.
Yeah. Well, everything you've just said segues quite nicely into what I want to ask next, and I guess what I want to end on as well,
Sure.
which is, for me, in the last few years, the desire to have kids has crept up.
Sure.
Seemingly, I don't know. Yeah. Before I knew it, it was something I wanted, and I think a huge part of that was just witnessing my 3 older siblings. They've all popped out kids now, and the one part of it is that seeing how that's transformed them as people.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
My older sister said this amazing line that everything she thought that was important beforehand just pales in comparison to what's important now. So that's just testament to that transformation that they've gone through. So that's one thing. But then the second thing is actually interacting with my nieces and nephews and just witnessing each of them as like these individual flowers blossom. And like the ingenuity and the wit and the way that they surprise you. And I had this conception of love being that it's something that potentially gets spread thin over time. The more you have to like dole it out to people, but that is so not true. Completely untrue. It does not work that way at all.
It only grows.
It's just infinite. Yeah, exactly. It only grows. So I think that's a big part of what's oriented me now towards the wanting to have kids, the importance of it. And the point you mentioned on the civilizational level, the importance of having kids as well is a massive, massive thing. A lot of my peers don't seem to share that same orientation.
Yes.
And I actually think it might even be related to a more broader phenomenon, which is that young people today have a kind of fear of commitment.
Yeah.
So you, as a parent of 5 kids, can you convey how significant it is to become a parent, start a family? And also, can you convey the importance of doing big, scary things in life and transforming as a result?
Yeah.
Enable us to like peer over the wall, on the other side. Yeah.
I think you made some really powerful points. And I think that, firstly, going back to what I said earlier about, even if it's for selfish reasons, care about others, I think one of the great struggles that much of the world is facing right now is, of course, a sense that for the first time in a long time, living standards are going down, not up, and that generations are becoming less prosperous than before. That's not the same everywhere, and there's nuance there, but that's generally a perception in the developed world that exists. And part of that is, of course, people want to replicate what they saw through their own childhood or the positives of their own childhood if they were to consider building a family and having children of their own. And people who say, for example, which is a fundamental reality, a far smaller percentage of the population can ever hope to, let's say, attain the stability of home ownership, let alone the economic stability that would facilitate long-term relationship, marriage, etc., yeah, that's a problem. And again, if one's only selfish, one would say, well, if that happens, there will be less children, and there will be, this is a horrible way to view the world. Again, I don't recommend this. I don't view the world this way, but if this will convince someone, then at least let it be this. Who will pay the taxes in the future that will support them in retirement? That's real.
Yeah.
In addition, again, I'm cognizant of the fact that there are people who, more than anything in the world, want to have children and can't, and haven't, and I'm conscious of how significant that is, and how much compassion and understanding people in that circumstance require. So I really do want to reiterate that. But at the same time, I will say something that I've thought about throughout my life is who are my primary concern is if I had to make a distinction, let's say, my wife or my children, where does my thing lie? And I used to think, sure, of course it's your children for your spouse. And actually the act of having children has actually changed it for me to say it's my wife, which might sound strange, but I'll explain what I mean. I can't think of anything that comes anywhere near my experience of having children. It is the defining factor of my life. Raising children is difficult. Raising 5 children in the same climate that we've said people face all these difficulties. I'm by no means immune to that. Is of course difficult, and comes with sacrifices of all different types every day. But like your sister said, those sacrifices becomes meaning. I don't care about those things anymore. I just fundamentally don't, and I just can't. I can't fathom a reality without my children, and my relationship to them is what I am. That is me, and with all of the difficulties that come, like I can't conceive of a purpose in waking up each day other than overcoming those challenges for my children. I don't have any other vision in my life, and it's just, and like everyone, I have all the time challenges, like unique challenges, common challenges, all kinds of things, and heartache every night when I go to sleep about different things with my children. But like, I have children. I have 5 human beings for whom I am their father. I am their only father. And that is terrifying. And that's the best thing ever. Like, what is there more than that? What possible pursuit could I ever have in my life that would be more than being somebody's father? What could possibly be in the same universe? I don't know. And so I said about my wife that's kind of what I mean by that is that through my process of having those children, I've seen we have a concept in Judaism when a couple is married of a chuppah, a wedding canopy that you get married under, and it's symbolic of the home that the couple build. And we say a binyan adayad, an eternal building, an eternal edifice that you're creating. And I think that the physical, we sometimes imagine that the physical symbology of the chuppah or of the house is what we're referring to, even symbolically, and I would say that's completely inaccurate. That eternal edifice, that eternal house, that eternal home, that eternal building is that family, is the family. And the vehicle for my construction of that family in a fundamentally spiritual sense is the new entity that is created by me and my wife. That we come together as something incomparable to the sum of our parts. We come as two flawed, fallible human beings, and we come together and we are life. We are the only vehicle, entity for the creation of life. I don't know that I even conceive anywhere near enough what that means. What that means. That through our love for each other, my wife and I, people speak about, Mother Earth, and we are that. We become that. For that moment. And we have this family, we have these children who are more important to me than anything in the world, who are the physical testament to what coming together, my wife and I, means. And so I've been incredibly fortunate that I have an incredible relationship with my wife, and I really do view her and see her that way. And that is, life is complicated in so many ways. And I know that, again, I don't want to cause hurt to people who don't feel that they have that. And I hope that anyone who doesn't feel that they have that does ultimately have that. And anyone who's had that and lost it can be sustained by the knowledge that that is eternal, even when the other person is gone, even when both are gone physically. That's what it means. That it is that what is created there never goes away. That always exists. And I just don't know, other than these things, what is more powerful. And I know that, there is a potential to cause people harm by speaking about children and partnership that people will never have or don't have or feel that they've lost. And I don't want to cause people pain in that regard. And I know that, there's this perception that the imposition of this idea of the nuclear family is, hurtful to people for whom that's not fitting in many other ways. And all of that's fair enough, and all of that deserves to be understood and appreciated and considered. But it doesn't change the fact of what that means. It doesn't dilute from what that means. And again, I think that as a community, as a humanity, if we lose sight of what that means, if we get to a position where we don't say this exists, but we must be infinitely tolerant and considerate of people for whom who are outside of that prism, that's fair. If we say, well, that doesn't apply to everybody, and not everybody has that, wants that, whatever, therefore that is meaningless. My goodness, I think that is a grave error. I think that is a grave error. It doesn't mean that there aren't other elements of life and the human experience that aren't important. Of course there are. But that is still something distinct. That is distinct, and it is literally life. It's literally life. And I just think it needs to be understood as such, yeah.
Zach, it's been an honour to talk to you today.
Oh, it's been mine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.